ask about the Bible for a second. What do you think about some of the more unpopular things in the Bible, like Peter 3:18 or whatever it is that says you should be submissive and good to your master as a slave or whatever they... Okay, very good. All right, so I don't know if you may remember, but Bill Maher did a segment on his show. I forget the name of it, where he's quoting Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament that's talking about slaves and masters and those relationships and all of that stuff. My first step would be to go straight to the fact that we are all created in the image and likeness of God. That is not disputed in the New Testament. That is upheld. All of the theology about treating people with decency, all of that stuff, absolutely. Holiness, all that stuff. We see some of this coming to a head in the letter of Philemon, where Paul is writing a letter, I think, to a slave owner, and his servant fled the slave owner. I guess he became a Christian, right? And Paul tells the slave owner to take back the servant, but not as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. You can kind of see a little bit where he's going with that. Now, number one, consider that there were various different forms of slavery. All right, I'll use that quotation mark, slavery in the Roman Empire. There's a difference between man selling and indentured servitude, for example. There's a difference to, you could be a person's servant and simply be in their employ, right? You could be, this is true of a person being a maid, for instance, you know. And so there are different ways of looking at the various types. Not normally people who hear the word slave, they're instantly thinking about the trans-American, slave trade, of Africans to America. They're looking at merely that. They're not even looking at the fact that, African tribes would conquer another African tribe, or an Indian tribe would conquer another Indian tribe, and they would enslave the people in which they conquered and took their land, and so on and so forth. And they're normally not thinking about that in terms of slavery. They're normally thinking about one specific thing and reading that into all of slavery. And that's not the way to look at it here. We have to look at it with the context of the various forms of servitude that existed at the time of the Roman Empire in the first century. So when we're looking at the apostolic age, we're looking at this stuff. We're not only looking at how the apostles, the church is applying church teaching, right, and the gospel and the teachings of Christ to their culture, which takes time, right, to change the culture. Yeah, sure, within the context of the church, you won't have, man selling going on and whatnot and stuff, and the church really constitutes a new people, a royal priesthood, right, a people set apart for God. You don't see that actually being lived out within the context of the church. That's something that has to be worked out in the culture over time. You got to plant seeds. You got to confront the culture over time. And so one of the first things that you can do is, okay, we live in a society that has these types of relationships work-wise, where a person might have a life debt or what have you. And what ends up happening is that, okay, how do we apply a Christian ethic to this sort of circumstance? If a person has a life debt or an obligation to a person to pay off a debt or something like that, obviously that they need to pay off their debts. Give to those to whom it is due. That's a New Testament principle. It comes straight from Paul. To pay off your debts and to be indebted to no one, and so on and so forth. So people who find themselves in those types of relationships, need to be able to fulfill their obligations within a context of a Christian ethic, right? So they really need to exhibit what it means to live a holy life in the context of the life in which they find themselves. This is true for people who are business owners and they're over people who are their servants, or you own somebody because of a life debt or because they're paying off a debt or some other reason, that you are to treat them with respect while they're paying off their debts, while they're working off their loan, or while they're paying for their injustice, and so on and so forth. There's various reasons in which a person might find themselves in these sorts of situations. So whether or not a person is on either side of these relationships, they need to be able to exercise Christian virtue while fulfilling their debts, fulfilling justice, making good on their commitments and responsibilities in the life in which they find themselves, in a way that honors Christ, in a way that is respectful to all other members in said relationship. So yes, when you look at it from that perspective, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it, Don? You know what I'm saying? But when it came to like man-selling and all of the stuff that was happening in America, that the Catholic Church was always against that stuff, because that stuff is contrary to that kind of stuff is contrary to the gospel. Now, I would get it if, like, let's say, for instance, one man from one tribe killed another man from another tribe, and so a member from the tribe where the man was killed, he was going to kill the guy who killed his friend from his own tribe, and said, you know what, I'm going to spare your life. You're going to come and work for me, right? And so he owes him a life debt because he saved his life. And then somebody who owns, quote unquote, owns that person in this sense, then sells them for a sum of money so that they would have that life debt with somebody else. In terms of like man-selling or transferring responsibility, or however they want to do it. It's not in a vacuum, and it's not malicious. It's this person was actually shown mercy, where they could have had justice, handed out to them, and they were killed. Could have been simply killed for an eye kind of thing, because they killed their friend. I mean, there's all kinds of different circumstances. You can't be absolute about some of this stuff. I personally don't have any difficulties about those things. I don't even consider them to be unpopular. So when Bill Maher was quoting that stuff, I'm like, yeah, there's so many moving parts to what you just said. All he's doing is quoting that Jesus made some comment about how if you don't do what the master wants, you're going to be stricken with many blows, that you could be owned by someone and beaten by them. And Jesus is using this as an example in some sort of story or whatnot, And he's like, well, yeah, you should be a Christian then, because look at this stuff. Like, no, there's more to all of that stuff. There always is. I mean, two things can be true at once. You can live within a culture in which you are trying to contextualize the gospel the best or most you can in the circumstances in which you are presently living, and it's completely another to have that as to be your ethic of exactly how things are supposed to be. Those are two totally different things. Two things can be true at once, right? You can contextualize a message, and you can also be against the context in which you find yourself.